are starting with entheogens versus prima entia. Entheogens are plants such as ayahuasca or peyote. Most generally, they have long-standing traditional use in shamanic practices. Can also be things like mushrooms or salvia divinorum, which was actually Gandhi's favorite herb. Entheogens are plants that have strong concentrations of alkaloids, usually, that allow people to open up to aspects of God or creation. That's my definition. I don't know if that's what you'd read in the dictionary. Like with Salvia divinorum, for example, I've never actually taken these things. I've taken herbal Salvia divinorum. I have never really taken drugs or anything to alter my consciousness through a chemical means that way. Not because I have a moralistic objection to most of it, because I don't, but because weird enough things were already happening to me, and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't drug-induced, that it was something happening on that psychospiritual level, that it wasn't some chemical. And I did take ecstasy one time because I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. And I get it, but I'm not doing it again. I see why people take it. My experience wasn't that it was that much different than really, really deep, intense meditation where you're open to everything. Only it takes all of 10 minutes and you're there. Coming down off of it is not fun. And that's the part I'm not interested in. The reason I explain this stuff about entheogens is because it really ties into understanding the ideas of the higher genius of plants. So when people take Salvia divinorum, it's very common that two reactions occur, statistically speaking. There's lots of published accounts of what happens. Either they have a horrible experience and come away from it saying, God, that was awful, I'll never want to do that again. Or often they have an experience where they end up meeting the children that are the way the intelligences present themselves to the people that have taken them. My thoughts on that are that many of the people that are taking these things are simply just trying to trip. They're abusing them because they just want another way to take a drug, to do something that's something they can get a hold of, or whatever they're doing. Their approach to the plant is disrespectful. They may not be doing that on purpose, but the plant spirits don't really care. If you're doing it for anything other than a pure reason to have a spiritual experience, they're going to give you one that ensures you're probably not going to want to come back. And all of the spirits are capable of doing that, but the ones that are from plants that we call entheogens are particularly noted for doing that, probably because they are the ones that have the alkaloids that allow people to access them simply from a chemical level. We have receptors for those alkaloids that do whatever they do, that open us up to certain things that are normally blocked from our conscious mind, and then they have access to communicate. Plant spirits can be encountered through the use of entheogens, but the experience is often based upon how the plant is being used. If you're just using it to trip, they're going to get you. Bottom line, most likely. But proper approach for entheogens can have profound effects. Ayahuasca is part of a long-standing spiritual tradition, and used properly, prepared properly, and ingested properly, has been well documented to lead people to profound spiritual depths and a better understanding of themselves, the world around us, the interconnectedness of everything, all kinds of things that ayahuasca does. Again, I've not taken it for very specific reasons. The difference between doing the entheogens one time and ingesting ends over a period of time is quite distinct, in that ingesting the ends, integrating the mother spirit into consciousness, is more gradual, but also more permanent. Whereas the entheogens process out of your system generally pretty quickly, and then that's closed. There's no permanent connection made. If someone were actually magically trained in the proper technique to constructively negotiate with the spirit of the plants that are present in entheogens, then they could perhaps maintain a more permanent contact. The problem being is that many of the entheogens are also moderately to extremely hallucinogenic. It's very difficult to maintain a normal thinking process and normal thinking consciousness, grounded decision making. All of those things are not really part of entheogen. That's just not how they generally work. It's a limitation. It's possibly a limitation created on purpose. It does make one dependent upon the plant, like the shamans that use the plant to be able to go in and do things. They become dependent upon the plant. Whereas with the alchemist's point of view, ingesting the ends until a more permanent connection is made, you're no longer dependent upon the ends of that particular thing. The ends is not physical. The ends itself, the entia themselves, are non-physical. What we do when we create the physical structure for the quintessence, we're kind of creating a chariot for that intelligence to ride in. It gives it a physical substance to connect to that then lets us physically get it into our physical body, where then it lets go of the physical part, and that intelligence then integrates with our consciousness. It's not that the quintessences are not physical. They have a physical component. But the ends itself is non-physical. So that's a very important thing to remember in this whole process. And that's why there are similar aspects between entheogens and the ends. But alchemists don't do these things to just trip. Because there's enough trippy stuff in magic and alchemy on the real level that you don't need to go looking for it. It will find you. At a certain point, things just happen. The other thing is that the powers of the ends of a particular plant do not necessarily correlate with the known effects of the plant as it is used in herbalism. Because remember, the quintessence is something that didn't exist before. We've taken these things and we've made this one thing out of other stuff, and it's a state of being that didn't exist before. So one of the challenges we have as a group, and one of the reasons why I wanted to put a group together in the first place, is the more people are part of that group, the more we can do individual research on more plants. One alchemist can only do so much research on so many plants, because it's not just making it. You have to ingest it for a while and then see, what is the effect of this plant? We know what the rejuvenative effects of Melissa and a couple of the other plants are because they've been handed down. But that's like 5. There's 5 plants that we know what they do. And they all basically are rejuvenatives. Those are the ones that were passed down. I'm of the opinion that while most quintessences are probably rejuvenative to some extent, that many plants store other parts of the archetypal things that are available to us if we simply know which plants do have that. It's a bit ambitious to try to figure some of that out. I think with a group of a decent size, we can certainly come to terms with more than 5. I don't think that's a stretch. And I may be wrong. It may be that other ends of plants don't have as much effect as the ones that are classed as rejuvenatives. And if we determine that, then we just move on to mineral work. The other thing is that when people take the ends of Melissa, all the alchemists that I have heard stories of, they take it for a little while and then they stop with no clear explanation. Some of them stop because of some of the stories that are renowned about it. Because one of the things that it does as a rejuvenative is it pushes out all of the stuff that's not supposed to be in your body. It purifies you. It doesn't heal you from disease or other things that are already fully manifested, but it will purify you of toxins. And that means pushing out things that are taking up residence in the body, like fungal infections and things like that. So most of the stories, when you read about these old guys that took ends and then documented what happened, their fingernails and their toenails fall out and all kinds of stuff. But if you really understand that it probably there wasn't any toenail left, it was just probably fungus. That's why it fell out. It's not that perfectly good stuff's going to fall out. It's also known that dental fillings are renowned for coming out during this process. Some people have a real problem with that. I was emailing with one of the alchemists in Saudi Arabia, telling him feedback from some of the people that I talked to where they were all gung-ho to do this. And then when they found out their fillings might fall out, they were terrified because of mercury and whatever else. And then it sets up a fear. And then the alchemist was like, well, but that's irrational, because if it's purifying you, it's pushing out the stuff that's not supposed to be there, which includes the mercury. And like, yes, I know that, but people don't make decisions on logic. They make them based on emotion most of the time. And when you're caught up in fear, you're definitely not making them on logic. So this has been a thing where people say, yes, I want to do alchemy. Yes, I want to take quintessences. Yes, I want to be transformed, but no, I don't want anything to change. That's not going to happen. Either it's real, and that's another reason why I think people have been content to play with advanced herbalism and call it alchemy, because they don't really have to change, but they get the emotional satisfaction of tinkering with glassware and doing whatever. But if that's the case, I'd rather just go hang out on the beach. I don't need to make a really elaborate diversion for myself if I'm not actually going to get anything out of it. There are things that happen, and another thing is if there are extreme dysfunctions in the mind, they get purified too. And I think the longer you take it, the more purified they get. But if your life is structured around those dysfunctions and all of a sudden things are being brought into alignment and you no longer relate to those dysfunctions, things in your life are going to fall away. And that may be painful. You may have a dysfunctional relationship. You may have, whatever they are. And then people become terrified that, oh, I might not have my relationship, or I might not have this, and they stop. And that's what fear does. It stops us from evolving. It's not that they're not legitimate, rational concerns or feelings. It's just either you really want real spiritual growth and you're going to buck up and take your medicine and deal with it, whatever that looks like, or you're not really, really looking for that. And even if somebody's not, it's okay, because this information gets planted. It's a seed in their consciousness. Maybe this lifetime, they're not going to do it, but maybe next time they will. If the seed doesn't ever get planted, nothing can grow. So I don't have an attachment to whether people do it or not. In fact, most of the time I try to discourage people from doing it because I know how much work it is. I also know that it's worth it. That's some of the things that can happen. Entia rule their species, but also hold powers related to specific aspects of natural laws. Therefore, they all do different things. That is a statement that I have made as a hypothesis. I believe that it is correct because it's logical. Because they can't all do the same thing. Or, Paracelsus would have said, every plant you make a quintessence out of is a rejuvenative. It just can't be that easy. Every plant does something different. It has a reason for existing. And on every level, everything that exists on every level, which means all the powers that exist, theoretically, should exist in the plant kingdom in the same way that they all exist within us embryonically. I believe that it is only finding them and identifying them that is the process that we don't have. So there's a lot of research to be done on that front, which is really cool because it's a lot more accessible for most people to do this than it is to do the more advanced parts. But this is still actually real alchemy because real quintessences are obtained, as opposed to 5 years of screwing around with the primo work as it's normally taught, just to learn the mechanics of glassware. I mean, you can learn it the same way by doing something real. At least you're making progress. So that's my viewpoint. So, quintessences, rewards on the path to the stone. Entia, we've already talked about as rejuvenatives and more to be discovered. Can't say anything much more than that because we don't know. Then there are the potables. Potable silver and potable gold. Once philosophic mercury is obtained. What's really groovy about this work with pyrolytic distillation and the obtaining of the white fume or the mercury portion of that, philosophical mercury portion, is that after we learn to make philosophic mercury from that, which involves a certain process of taking up into it a certain of the other materials that are obtained once they're purified. They have to be taken up into the mercury in a certain sequence, kind of like a Rubik's Cube, or you won't get them all in there because one will merge with it without that one going in first, then the other thing can't get in. So you have to know the order, the sequence that it's taken up in. But if you succeed in obtaining that, then all you have to do to obtain potable gold is take gold and put it in there. What philosophic mercury does is it separates things into its philosophical principles. All by itself. Ambient temperature. You just stick it in there. That's what it does. Which is a very cool thing. So what potable silver and potable gold are, basically are the sulfur portion, the soul portion of physical gold and physical silver. And then it still has a body in the spirit, but the soul portion, what we would call the essential oil of a plant. Now, metals don't have oils, but everything that exists has a sulfur principle. And what the philosophic mercury does is it separates it all out. So potable gold and potable silver are ingestible, and they heal the body of all kinds of things. Potable silver cures mental things, things with a nervous system, things like that. Potable gold is renowned to be almost as effective as the elixir of life, but far easier to obtain. Theoretically, when we talk about the complexity of making the Philosopher's Stone, which, by the way, you cannot make until you've succeeded in making the philosophic mercury. So as we work towards completing the work of the stone, we have to create other things to be able to do that work. But as we succeed in creating those things, we get a reward, which then lets us live a little longer to reach the goal. So it's not that you make a plant quintessence and all of a sudden you get to live a really long time. You don't. You can maintain a certain biological age for a period of time, but you are still going to have to work towards philosophic mercury if you want to really be able to cure disease out of the body, because the ends will purify you, but it's not going to get rid of things that have already started or whatever comes about. And then the third thing is the actual Philosopher's Stone, which then you're able to take and make the elixir of life, which is basically just taking tiny portions of the stone and putting it in something ingestible. It's the dosage that's the issue. I think with potable silver and potable gold, the dosage is, I'm sure, is an issue, but it's not as much of an issue because it's just a separated aspect. It isn't physical God in a stone. That's a lot. And then the other thing is, though, when you first obtain the stone, you're not done. Obtaining it is one thing. Multiplying it and increasing its power is a whole nother process. It's very similar to the first part of the process, but it's still part of the process. And at any point along the way, you can screw it up. And then you got to start over. Of course, you'll get there faster because you did it before, but that's part of the heartache that a lot of alchemists have gone through. They have succeeded in obtaining the stone, but then not necessarily knowing how it's multiplied or any of the other processes, because at a certain point they were on their own. It was left to trial and error. And the best that they could deduce through their own consciousness if they had contact with anything that was helping them or anything that adepts wrote on the subject. But there's not a lot of information written about that part. It's just not talked about. And the basic assumption is if you can get that far, then you can figure the rest out. It doesn't mean it's going to happen the first time. So the other cool thing about this, which we've already talked about, is possible alternative paths to prima entia work, which is obtaining philosophical mercury from advanced plant work to work as an alternative to spirit of wine in the traditional ENS process. We, instead of pouring on ethanol, we can use the spirit of the philosophic mercury in place of it. That comes with some complications because this is evaporative at room temperature, which means that process has to be done colder. So the exciting thing about that is that creates the alternative process for anyone with alcohol issues. Understanding allegory, its purpose, and misdirection. I'm not sure if this is the exact definition of allegory, but this is my definition. Truths wrapped in clever lies. It's never what it looks like. Alchemists use a lot of allegory, but there's a lot of allegory in religion. It's there for a reason. Passing along the understanding of something is not as effective as passing along the allegory, because allegory is easier to pass. If someone gains understanding, they can then see the allegory for what it is. But if they don't have the proper understanding, they're just going to believe the allegory in either a literal or symbolic way, which is most of what religion is. And that doesn't invalidate it. They're still talking about very real things. They're just not what we think they are. And we've been led to those conclusions on purpose in a manner of misdirection. The thing is, if it's true on one level, it has to be true on all levels. However, the knowledge of how it's applied on each level is usually very different and definitely not obvious. So that's the challenge of figuring out allegory. So an example is the conjunction of the sun and the moon as principal alchemical allegory. This is advanced inner work. It also relates to the physical work, but it's mostly talked about in the inner work, which is odd because they don't talk about inner work very much, but it's all in the depictions. And this is depicted as male and female, but really it relates to the conscious and unconscious mind. So the enactment of allegory in ritual and ceremony within religion was meant as a vehicle for preserving the allegory. But the enactment of the allegory is not the process itself. So in magical practice, it is used symbolically in ritual to affect the psyche, the entire complex, which can work to an extent if done properly, but usually it's not effective. The most common application of this allegory is an attempt to use physical sex as a magical process. Doesn't really work very well. Polarity shift can happen with this use, though it's very rare. Problem is that it doesn't usually work when it's contrived on the physical level. Crowley would be a case in point. He spent years bouncing back and forth between male companions and female companions for the specific purpose of messing with his polarity, trying to make the conjunction of the sun and the moon happen. I'm not convinced that he ever did. The only reason I have that opinion is because that happened to me a long time ago. And I wasn't trying to do it on purpose. The ultimate objective of taking myself out of a certain box was my objective, but I didn't even think about it in this way. And when it happened, I was absolutely astounded. Because it's not, oh, I think I felt something. It's like the left side of your body slams to the right and the right slams to the left, and you know exactly what happened. It's the most peculiar thing. So since 1997, that's the way I've been inside. So I'm in a male body, but I don't necessarily know that I feel one way or the other. It's just the way it is. that was brought about as a process between magical things, consciousness development through magical practice. But the actual happening itself had absolutely nothing to do with any of that. It was a ripeness issue. When your consciousness is ripe enough for certain things to happen, they happen. Just like when an apple is ripe enough to fall off a tree, it's going to happen. It doesn't matter how much you pray to keep an apple on the tree. It's going to fall off. So when I say that I don't think Crowley succeeded, it's because in the writing that he left, most of the time, he's really kind of ambiguous about that particular subject as to whether it actually worked or not. He believed in the process of the polarity changing, but it was always contrived. And I have lots of thoughts on Crowley, and Thelemites don't particularly like them, but I think he was very cool. I think that he was, for his time, quite amazing, considering he was in the Victorian era of all things, considering his background, tortured as a child because his father was a fundamentalist Baptist minister. I think for who he was and what he had to work with, and the fact that he didn't actually have initiation from an adept, regardless of who gave him a ceremony in whatever order, blah, blah, blah. They were revivalist traditions trying to figure things out, and they did make a lot of ground. But they were not real adepts. Not according to the definitions that I use anyway, that are the definitions of the adepts I was taught by. They just don't line up with those definitions. That doesn't diminish what he accomplished as a person. It just means that he started off with a severe handicap and made it through a lot of interesting experiences. As a result of that, though, as a result of the Victorian era, as a result of Freud and Jung, and all of the things that came about in that time, mixed with some of the interesting things that Crowley came up with, there are some really bizarre notions about sex and magic, and that those things are somehow alchemy. And they're not. They're not at all alchemy. I don't care how many magic triangles you draw in the air. That's not alchemy. And I don't care how many times you stick a blade into a chalice and stir wine and call it consecrated. That's not alchemy. It's allegory. And there's a ton of it. And it's all useful because, again, allegory is very easy to pass along through religion. The danger is that the people believe it literally instead of trying to understand it even metaphorically. Some people do take things metaphorically, and that's a step up from literal. Understanding it allegorically, though, is a step up from metaphor. And that's when you understand that that really has absolutely nothing to do with what you see in front of you in terms of the ritual itself. You're really talking about learning how to make the male and female aspects of your consciousness become one thing. That's the beauty of allegory and the danger of allegory. Because in order to preserve it, you end up creating religions that have these crazy ideas. So again, this idea of the sun and the moon to take the allegory into practical lab work. What we're then talking about, the sun and the moon naming conventions. The fire, this is the sun, and this is the moon. So when you start understanding how these things really line up in terms of the different ways that they're presented, the sun, fire, sulfur, red fume, these are all different ways in a certain aspect of the practical laboratory work of saying the exact same thing, or describing perhaps different levels of the same work in slightly different processes. But this is always what they refer to in some manner or another. We have red fume, white fume. We have red wine, white wine. Red mercury, white mercury. Sulfur, mercury. Can get a little confusing. That's why when you read an adept, you have to stay holistically within the document he created. You can't jump, not until you understand. Once you know these different conventions, then when you read that Lully called these things red wine and white wine. He was kind of the founding person that really talked about this particular path. And then others came along and called it the red mercury and the white mercury. Hollandus calls it the red fume and the white fume. Now, they're clearly involved in the same tradition, but over time, they referred to them in different ways. I think they kind of did it on purpose to a certain extent because they were aware of the fact that over one long span of time, alchemists referred to the same thing by many different names. So if they'd all called it red wine and white wine, it would have been an obvious tie that those things were connected. But they didn't. These men were more clever than we'll ever comprehend in the way that they just had to live and work and process. I mean, these were people that can probably just work a cryptex because, well, that's just part of daily life when you're an alchemist in the medieval age. I'm glad we don't have to deal with that. But once you experience the process, or at least understand it intellectually, but at least particularly see it one time, then you begin to understand what they're saying, even though they're not saying everything. And then that gives you a starting point to start working. The main crux of allegory is to take something and spin it into something else. So, to make an example that might get me in trouble, I'm not picking on Christianity, because to me, it's a very valid representation, but it is very allegorical. So the allegory is, unless you're born again, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. The problem is in understanding what born again actually means. And so in alchemy, we understand that we have a lunar body and we have a solar body. And then in order to be born into the stellar body, that body of light, the sun and the moon have to have a conjunction. That's being born again because you end up with a new body. You can't get into heaven until you have that body because you don't exist at the right frequency, basically, to do it. You don't have the right setup. We are all meant to evolve to that body of light. How long it takes us, that's subjective. What Christ was saying, if you accept that he really was walking around and he really said that, and I have no reason to argue with that, what that means is exactly that. What people don't realize is that the kingdom of heaven is a state of consciousness. It's not a place. It's the state of eternity. No time. And no physical limitation. It also corresponds in Kabbalah to the state of Binah, which is a conjunction in Hebrew of Benya, which means sons of God. You can't get into the kingdom of heaven unless you become a son of God. When you start unraveling the allegory and you understand the alchemy behind the mechanics of how things work and some of the magical overlap, because bits and pieces are left in the magical tradition and bits and pieces are left in the alchemical tradition and bits and pieces are in the religious writings. When you figure out how to line them up in a way that is how things work, it unlocks those doors. So we come back, we evolve, we die, we evolve some more, we keep doing it until we get ripe enough as spiritual fruit that the higher genius basically picks us and says, okay, you don't have to do that anymore. You're going to now evolve into the next level of being. We come back here and we do this over and over and over again, and we struggle. And people that want to run around and pretend that they're victims to the process don't really understand that it's not being done to us, and it's not being done for anything other than the fact that that's how we evolve to the next level of being, and it's absolutely necessary, and somebody can't come along and do it vicariously for us. It cannot happen. And if you look at nature, there are many examples of what happens when you mess with it. If you have ever watched a butterfly break out of its cocoon, it struggles and it struggles and it struggles. And if you have any empathy at all, you're like, oh, that poor thing. The first impulse, rolling around in your emotion, is to help it. But the problem is that if it doesn't force, if it doesn't struggle, if it doesn't push against that cocoon, it doesn't develop any strength. And then it can't fly. So you might help it get out of the cocoon, but it's going to die because it can't fly. And we are no different in our metamorphosis, in our chrysalis. In this process, it's just requires more incarnations and it's a little more complicated, but it's the same process. So the idea of vicarious atonement only goes so far. And it's not that there isn't a Christ aspect. It's that is our higher genius. It is an aspect of our higher genius on a personal level. And we can attain to that level when we can reach a level of solar consciousness. Tifereth in Kabbalah is directly related to that solar consciousness. And we can learn to communicate with that aspect of ourselves if it's done in the right way. And I can attest that that's absolutely a true statement because I was taught that. And I was completely floored by the results of it. So much so that I got myself in trouble because you're not supposed to make assumptions. You're not supposed to have expectations. So when you say that something shocked you, you're automatically in trouble because that implies you had an expectation. I mean, every time you turn around with an adept, you're in trouble. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how good a student you are. You're going to be in trouble for something, no matter what. So you just get used to it. You just suck it up and you move on. But it is absolutely true. And what the mystery traditions always provided between the lesser mysteries, which are lunar, and the greater mysteries, which were solar, was all of the key pieces that go together that somebody has to evolve through in order to create that next state of consciousness, to step across that abyss and reach the state of becoming a son of God. So we have that already on one level, but it's not the level that's us. It's the higher genius. And technically, the higher genius is eternal. We can fool around with this for lifetimes. It doesn't really care on a certain scale. But it's the one pulling the strings. It's the one creating our experiences. It's the one molding our reality to shape us into becoming what it wants us to become. So that's why we can't have judgment of what other people do or have done, whether we think it's egregious or atrocious or whatever it is. Ultimately, until they reach a state of consciousness where they're allowed to have the reins, which is that state of consciousness, being a son of God, they're not really fully, totally in control. Basically, to a certain extent, we're sock puppets. We're not in control of anything. We try, we still have to do our best. But really, the higher genius is in control. So, on one hand, that's kind of liberating. And on the other hand, it feels a little weird. But the whole point of getting to a certain state of consciousness is so that we can fully merge with the higher genius and then have reached that level of evolution. All these other stages in between are just simply steps on the ladder that have to be gone through, and each one of them is a little weird and a little different and contrary to what intuition often says, because those obstacles are put there by nature to keep things from being where they're not supposed to be. Everything has a guardian. If we're not supposed to go there, its job is to keep you out. As soon as you evolve to the point where you're supposed to be there, that guardian turns into a guide. But it's the same intelligence. It has a binary function. It's just good to have a helpful context of how those things fit into what we're doing, because they are related, because everything has an intelligence, and what we're learning to do is create an effective means of being able to integrate it in a way that is philosophically sound, safer than a lot of other things, and leads to understanding with a capital U. It's that understanding that's actually the most important part of the whole process. It's the doing of those things is a demonstration of understanding. The bottom line really is the understanding. The stones in the work, which is different than the potables. potable silver and potable gold that come from putting gold or silver in the philosophical mercury. If we were to take these materials and then work towards creation of a stone, of course, you get to the white stone before you get to the red stone, but the white stone cures diseases of the mind, lunar-related things. It transmutes base metals into white noble metals, which is silver, platinum, uranium. Those are all white noble metals. The red stone cures all illness and solar-related things and transmutes base metals into gold. Transmutation was not the goal of the true adepts. They wouldn't pull 2 hairs for a pile of gold, for the most part, unless they had a reason, like something they needed to do, and that was just part of the process. But truly, by the time someone reaches the level of mastery and they can make the elixir of life and they have the philosopher's stone, they can transcend their body anytime they want to. They can go anywhere they want to. They don't need gold. But the transmutation is still vital because that is the test for whether it's the medicine or not. If it doesn't transmute, it's not the medicine. And that's why it was a vital part of the process. And that's why it's become part of the story. It's the part that everybody knows, even though they don't know why. So these things have tests. If you think you've made the white stone and you take lead and you project the stone onto the lead and it doesn't turn into silver or something else that's a white noble metal, you did not make the white stone. You missed something. Something in the process wasn't right, even if it looks like what you think it should look like. If it doesn't do that, that's not what it is. Now, the first round that you get, you're not going to take all that and use it all into transmutation. So it has to be, there's some other things, it has to be multiplied a few times, increase the quantity of it, and then you use a little bit of it. You don't use the whole batch, you just succeed in attaining and throw it on metal and take a gamble. Because if you screw up, then you got to go, all you're going to get is a great big pot of silver. You still don't have any medicine. So you have to be really judicious, in theory, of what you're going to parcel out to multiply and what you're going to test. There's no point in multiplying something or trying to multiply. I guess you wouldn't really be able to multiply it if it weren't actually the stone. Either way, in theory, it has to be tested. Because if it's not the stone, it's probably poison. So the testing and the transmutation is vital. If it doesn't do that, then it will probably kill you. Ingesting the improper dose of the real thing will kill you too if you're not prepared for it. And those doses were taken in extreme dilution. The stories that we have of people having taken the stone and died is because that's the problem when they come upon things that they didn't work for. Edward Kelly, case in point, he was a bit of a rogue, but he was a seer in Elizabethan times, and he worked as a seer for John Dee for a long time. They had a long-standing relationship. John Dee was a very respectable man. He was considered the most educated man in the whole world. He had the largest personal library in the world that we know of, and worked as astrologer for Queen Elizabeth. I mean, this wasn't a nobody. His association with Edward Kelly caused him trouble because, well, he was a bit of a scoundrel, but a very talented seer. And since John Dee was not a very good seer, he had to rely on a seer. At one point, Edward Kelly found a stash of transmutation powder. And of course, in true roguery and ego, made transmutations for people, royal people, and traveled all over the courts of Europe and got lodging and this and that and would do transmutations. And in the beginning, because they didn't know the power of the stone, which it turned out their stone was actually really, really powerful. It had been multiplied many times, but they didn't know that. So they wasted a whole bunch of it to transmute without realizing they were using way too much of it. Again, due to the ignorance of not knowing, hey, test it on a smaller portion first. You know, they didn't know any of that. By the time they got done figuring that out, they didn't have as big a portion of it left. And then they still paraded around and made demonstrations. But instead of Edward Kelly saying, hey, I don't know how you make this, but we found it, and this proves that this is real. His ego couldn't just let him do that. He had to tell people that he was the alchemist and that he made it. Well, when he ran out of it, that got him locked in a tower because, I don't know, whichever potentate that was, Germany, Bavaria, wherever that was, they wanted more. What potentate wouldn't want somebody they could just make gold for them? John Dee eventually made his way back to England and was given a small pension and lived out in not exactly splendor, but not squalor either. But Edward Kelly ended up falling out of a tower window on his second attempt to escape from one or another of his little mishaps and broke his neck, and that was the end of that. But all of that could have been avoided simply by telling the truth. Yeah, we found this powder. We found a stash of it. This proves that it exists. We'd like to do some research to figure it out. He always had the delusion that he could figure it out. So he set about trying to figure it out. It wasn't that he didn't put in any effort. He just ran out to, oops, he was trying to figure it out. He just never did. I think he was delusional enough to believe that he was going to. And of course, if you didn't do the work to get there, it's not going to happen. So it's unfortunate. But these cases are documented. These presentations in these royal courts were recorded in front of people who had no reason to lie about it. Those courts had court reporters or the documenters that wrote down everything that happened. And it's there in history in black and white. So there's no reason to doubt it. It's just dumb when you think about losing your life for making grandiose claims for things that you can't follow up with. And that's another reason why it's a pet peeve of mine. Certain alchemical groups have courses and things, and when you pass them all, they send you a little paper certificate that says Master Alchemist. And I just about want to come out of my skin because I would never allow anyone to call me those things. So I'm not. The idea that somebody would parade around and think that they're a Master Alchemist just because they got a certificate from something. But then these people who have then done that then go hold classes. And then they teach Albertus Regurgita, and people think they're learning alchemy. And it bugs me. And when I said something to one of the alchemists about it being annoying and about doing something about it, he said, why? The people that do all that don't want to learn real alchemy anyway. I was kind of irritated about that. But again, adepts are kind of grumpy, so they have a certain viewpoint. I understand what he's saying. And at the same time, it's still irritating because there are people who really do want to learn real alchemy. And I guess the universe will bring them to that point when they're ready from a certain point of view. I get that. At the same time, not saying something when people are running around teaching whatever, the longer people don't say anything, the longer that's going to run on. And at least informing people that there's an alternative path is very helpful. I feel the same way about magic. That brings us into mainstream teaching versus adept training. And this is based on my experience of it. Mainstream teaching, there's a lot of busy work. You learn the Hebrew letters, or you learn this, or you learn that. And even Aleister Crowley made a joke about it. They swore me to terrible oaths of secrecy and then entrusted me with the Hebrew alphabet. I kind of get it. With adepts, there's no busy work. It's just work. And it's doing work, and that work leads to understanding. And they don't spell it all out for you, and they don't connect all the dots. They give you the work. They see how you do with it. If you gain the understanding from that you're supposed to get, then you get to go on to the next part. And if you don't, you don't. I don't know if they all do it that way. That was my experience with most of them. And the adept viewpoint is that practical is what works because it's what is real. There is no, I think this is real because I choose to believe it. That's not an adept viewpoint. If you believe something, the adept is open-minded enough to say why. You better have a good reason. If you just believe it because it's what was taught to you and you just accepted it, then that's really what belief is. because the difference is you either believe or you know. If you know, you don't need to believe. You only believe when you don't know, and that's dangerous. And that's why adepts are very big on not making assumptions. So it's okay to declare what you don't know, but don't make assumptions for things that you think you know, but you don't. And that's where most magical training stuff kind of is. It's kind of like they're in the adolescent phase of growing up from the revivalist birth, which is still progress and evolution and growth. And there are a number of independent thinking magical people that put things out, but there's still so much regurgita and not thinking about it, just perpetuating planetary hours and craziness that has no real practical basis. You know, when you understand that the sun and the moon have nothing to do with where the sun and the moon are, you can do the inner work, and it doesn't matter where they are, because they're all in there. If they're all in there, there are no planetary hours. And I'm not saying that those things don't have influence. Clearly, what the moon does has influence on us and on the Earth. And I mean, you'd have to be an idiot to disagree with that. As to what the other planets do and what influences they have, that's not really the point. Again, the point is that those intelligences are non-physical. They're everywhere, but they have a physical representation in those planets. So everything non-physical still has a physical vehicle, because that's all we have, physical and non-physical. In the non-physical, there's all kinds of compartments created, but still it's non-physical. And those intelligences exist, but they have anchors. And when the anchors move, the range of what they do and what they influence on a physical level, there is truth to that. From a magical point of view, though, it's kind of irrelevant. That's like saying your car moves because it has gears, but you don't need to focus on the gears to get in the car and drive it down the road. We have the body. We have all the parts. We don't need to focus on what the planets are doing. We need to focus on what our parts are doing and learn how to make them do what we need to learn how to make them do. We don't have to worry about where Jupiter is. It's really a distraction. So understanding why is the key to spiritual evolution, not just acceptance. And the final word is, if you don't understand why, then you don't fully understand. And that's okay. Being aware that you don't fully understand is then what drives you to go understand. There are places where I have blind spots. I'm aware of them. There may be others that I'm not aware of yet because I didn't get around that corner, but I am aware of a few of them. And as I do research and continually strive towards understanding them, those pieces come. Slowly, but they come. And they come in surprising ways. Like there's a set of 7 things that I need to understand to do the next step. And I have 4 of them. One of them came the other day. I had 2 of them for a while. I had 2 of them 2 years ago. And then there was another one. Got the other one the other day. How long it takes for the next 3 to come, I don't know. But it's important for a certain viewpoint of the particular process that's required for me to go to the next thing that I'm supposed to do. So they throttle you to a degree. Your higher genius will put a throttle on you because you can't just get there before it's time to get there. You can't get ripe before you're ready to be ripe because you're not the only one here. You're connected to everything else. If you have a purpose, then you can't be ahead of schedule or you're going to screw up everybody else's train schedule. However that works, I'm just glad I don't have to be in charge of that. All I have to do is my best. Make an effort. Keep doing it. Don't stop. And that means every day it looks a little different. I have to do work, and then I have to balance testing out different ends processes and figuring out what it takes to make Melissa plants happy because you think you watered them and you turn around because they look fine, and 3 hours later you walk by and they're all passed out being dramatic. I'm like, really? I just watered you. What's your deal? They all have their own thing, and you just juggle it until you get all the pieces where they need to be. Well, I've been juggling this particular process for 1.5 years. Now I'm finally ready at the point where I know that all the pieces are there. But it's 1.5 years. The reason I do this is so that other people don't have to do the 1.5 years. We all stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us, and we all have to honor them because they too were doing the best they could, and their higher genius was in control, and those pieces need to be put into place, and that's just how the game works. That's why I like alchemy, because at least you know while you're playing the game that your pieces are validated because stuff works. It's not just belief. Because even in magic, when we have extreme experiences that are valid because they're extreme experiences, we don't always have the check and balance system to know whether those extreme experiences are what we think they are or not. It takes a certain level of consciousness to be developed, because those aspects that are whose job it is to keep us in the box until we're ready to get out of the box are the most clever aspects that exist in the entire universe aside from God. And it's their job to keep us in that box. And if they have to give us delusions of grandeur to keep us trapped, they will. And if we don't know that that's what they're doing, or we're content to roll around in them, then we have no more evolution and they did their job. And so that's something that we have to guard against continually. Just because you have an experience doesn't make you king of the world. It just means you made some progress on an evolutionary path. It wasn't too long after I started doing artwork, drawing and doing things that were archetypal, I really was connecting to certain energies, which I always thought was a little bit kind of airy-fairy. I always had artistic ability, but I never really did anything with it because I was too busy dealing with business stuff. I just repressed all that. And then it got to the point where it wouldn't let me. I had to draw these things because the intelligences that were coming through wanted depiction. Depicting them gives them form somehow. It gives them an anchor. And when I started working on one that was an underworld guardian, I got pulled through a veil, taken out of my sleep, pulled through a veil into a whole nother level of reality. That had never happened before. So one of the magical things I find interesting is that for all the talk of evocation, one of the things people don't realize, if you have the power to evoke an entity into this world and you make a connection with it, it has the power to pull you into theirs too. Nobody talks about that. And until it happens to you, you don't realize that that's actually true. And if you think drawing a little chalk circle on the floor is going to stop that from happening, you're out of your mind, because that means you don't understand how evocation works. So there's a lot to talk about on the magical side of things. This was just to kind of talk about the alchemical side of things, so that way when we're talking about the magical things, we can reference the alchemical stuff we've covered and it makes sense. Otherwise, it's just way too much to do and would take like 5 days. I think it's important to cover it in large chunks of time, because covering it once a week in little itty bits of time as people can kind of give their attention to it, it doesn't really do it justice. And it doesn't all get in there to where it can plant itself.